There was no warning, no scream, no trace of struggle. On the morning of October 16, 2012, 21-year-old Whitney Heichel left her apartment in Gresham, Oregon, at approximately 6:45 a.m. She never arrived at the Starbucks where she worked. Her absence wasn't immediately considered an emergency. After all, young adults get sick, oversleep, or occasionally forget a shift. But by 9 a.m., that casual concern turned into urgent alarm. Clint Heichel, her husband, was the first to raise the red flag. Whitney's phone was going straight to voicemail. She hadn't texted, called, or returned any of the messages he sent after her sudden no-show. That behavior was completely out of character. Whitney was punctual, dependable, and consistent to the point of routine. And that routine had just broken. By late morning, the Gresham Police Department entered the picture. Officers canvassed the couple's apartment complex at 2230 SE Palmquist Road. There was no sign of a break-in. Her keys, wallet, and cell phone were gone with her, but her makeup bag and personal planner, both items she never left home without, were still in the car. That detail bothered Detective Tony Wrights. It was too fast, too clean. A missing person isn't usually this quiet, he said later. The problem wasn't the absence of leads, it was the absence of anything at all. No distress signals, no known enemies, just a 21-year-old barista, happily married, vanishing between her front door and the driver's seat of a 1999 Ford Explorer. By 12:30 p.m., the vehicle was located, abandoned in the parking lot of a local Walmart off NE 181st Avenue. The driver's side window was shattered inward. The SUV's tires were coated in a thick layer of reddish-brown mud, inconsistent with paved urban streets. There were multiple ATM withdrawal attempts on Whitney's debit card earlier that morning. Detectives reviewed footage from the gas stations where the transactions occurred. It showed Whitney's SUV pulling in, driven by an unknown male, partially obscured by a hoodie. Whitney wasn't visible. The driver moved quickly, paid in cash, and left before pumping gas at one station. Surveillance footage confirmed the same SUV made two different stops in opposite directions within a 40-minute interval. It was a pattern with no reasonable civilian logic. Forensics arrived on the scene. Partial fingerprints were lifted from the driver's side window glass and gear shift. Analysts collected fibers and trace soil from the wheel wells. A small smear of blood was recovered from the passenger side door handle. DNA analysis would take time, but already the profile building in the background didn't match a random act. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone knew Whitney's routine. Someone planned this. The SUV's mileage log revealed an additional 40 miles not accounted for in the known timeline. With that data, search grids were extended outward toward more remote and forested areas outside the city. Inside the vehicle, a single coffee cup still sat in the console, untouched. A partially opened granola bar was lodged under the seat. Her work apron was folded neatly in the back, untouched. These weren't signs of a panicked escape. They were signs of an interrupted morning. Something had stopped Whitney before her day even began. As police continued to gather evidence, interviews began. Friends, co-workers, neighbors. Among them was a soft-spoken 24-year-old maintenance worker who lived in the same complex as Whitney. He offered his help early, volunteered to search, mentioned knowing the Heichels from religious meetings. "Just doing what I can," he said. His name didn't raise flags yet. At the end of the first 24 hours, the facts were simple, cold, and incomplete. Whitney Heichel was last seen alive at 6:45 a.m. Her SUV was moved across the city by an unidentified driver between 7 o'clock and 9 a.m. The vehicle showed signs of tampering, unknown travel, and attempted ATM access. She had no enemies, no criminal history, and no reason to disappear. There was no ransom, no confession, no communication, just an expanding radius of uncertainty. As one officer quietly noted in his shift report, "In towns like Gresham, disappearances aren't supposed to happen like this. They don't feel like cases. They feel like something sacred got broken." Within 6 hours of discovering Whitney Heichel's abandoned SUV, Gresham PD shifted its investigative posture. The initial missing person designation was dropped. This was now a probable abduction. And by midday, analysts from the Digital Forensics Unit began parsing data from 3 primary sources: ATM activity, cell tower pings, and the vehicle's odometer. The first verified ATM transaction occurred at 9:14 a.m. from a Chevron station off 257th Avenue. Surveillance confirmed the vehicle matched Whitney's 1999 Ford Explorer. The footage didn't reveal a clear face, but it did show a single individual, male, approaching the ATM, inserting a card, hesitating, then retreating. No withdrawal occurred. Minutes later, a second attempt was logged at a different gas station just under 5 miles away. Same card, no funds withdrawn, 2 failed transactions, same vehicle, different direction, same driver. The timeline immediately introduced an inconsistency. If Whitney left home around 6:45 a.m. and wasn't seen again, why was her vehicle still in motion nearly 2.5 hours later in the opposite direction of her workplace? And more pressingly, who was driving? Cell phone triangulation placed Whitney's device near the I-84 corridor between 7:30 and 9 a.m. However, her signal disappeared shortly before the first ATM attempt. Her phone had either been disabled manually or destroyed. This detail, minor on its surface, added weight to the theory that someone was methodically erasing traceability. Technical analysts then retrieved location logs from the SUV's GPS module. Though rudimentary compared to newer models, the system stored short-term travel data. This confirmed that after Whitney left her residence, the vehicle made a sharp turn away from her standard work route, continued southeast through Troutdale, and made several prolonged stops in isolated areas near Dodge Park and Larch Mountain Road, locations known more for hiking trails and abandoned lots than any urban access. The odometer logged 42 additional miles than what would be expected on a standard round trip to Starbucks. That mileage matched closely with the route through heavily wooded areas north of the Bull Run watershed. This was not incidental travel. Detectives reconstructed the journey manually, based on timestamps from the ATM cameras and directional data from the GPS. The individual behind the wheel had knowledge of the terrain. These weren't random turns. They were calculated detours. Whoever was operating that vehicle wasn't panicking. They were following a route they likely knew beforehand. By this point, the Oregon State Crime Lab had processed early samples lifted from the vehicle. Trace soil beneath the fenders and wheel wells contained mineral concentrations consistent with unpaved forestry roads near Larch Mountain. Additionally, plant matter, fir needle clusters, and decomposing moss suggested the vehicle had been parked for some time under dense canopy. This directly contradicted the idea of a carjacking or opportunistic crime. The driver hadn't just stolen a car, they used it as transport to a remote location, attempted to access the victim's bank account multiple times, and then abandoned the vehicle within city limits in a manner that avoided detection for several hours. Digital timelines established one forensic certainty. Whitney was no longer with her car after approximately 7:30 a.m. Surveillance never showed her at any ATM. No neighbors saw her return. Her phone signal stopped transmitting shortly after leaving the apartment complex. Detective Wrights wrote in his evening report, "The route doesn't reflect chaos, it reflects familiarity. Whoever did this knew exactly where to take her and how long they had to do it." No new suspects had emerged, but one person from the immediate vicinity had volunteered to help, twice. He had offered vague details about the morning's timeline. He had no confirmed alibi between 6:30 and 9 a.m. His name was already on the report, not as a suspect, yet. With the vehicle processed, search teams were now preparing to move into the zone that digital data had silently mapped out, the forested expanse east of Gresham. 42 miles of movement, 2 ATM stops, 0 communication, 1 missing woman, and the growing sense that the answers weren't in the city anymore. By the second morning of the investigation, ground teams were directed east of Gresham toward the Larch Mountain corridor. This wasn't speculation, it was targeted search, based on layered GPS logs, odometer deltas, and forensic soil analysis. Detectives had enough markers to justify resource deployment, and for the first time in the case, the focus moved from the city to the terrain. Larch Mountain covers more than 4,000 acres of dense timberland, accessible only by narrow logging roads and seasonal trails. It's not a place someone stumbles into by accident. The Oregon State Police, along with Multnomah County Search and Rescue, established a perimeter along Palmer Mill Road, matching the furthest GPS coordinates pinged from the victim's vehicle. Topographic maps were overlaid with timestamps from the Chevron surveillance, allowing forensic analysts to mark specific turnoffs likely used during the unknown driver's 2-hour route. Every detail was narrowed to a corridor less than 5 miles wide. Volunteers, cadaver dogs, and mounted search crews were dispatched. Within 3 hours, a deputy located what he initially described as a disturbed surface, compressed brush, overturned moss, and an unnatural clearing roughly 30 feet from the gravel road. Human remains were visible just beneath a light layer of broken branches. The body was partially clothed, positioned near a decaying log, with visible contusions on the arms and legs. A plastic bottle, partially crushed, was found nearby. The remains were confirmed to be female. A work ID found in a pants pocket read, Whitney Heichel, Starbucks, Gresham, Orr. Detectives secured the scene. Photography, perimeter marking, and environmental mapping began immediately. Forensic pathologists from the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office arrived within 90 minutes. Their initial observations were consistent with a physical assault. Cause of death could not be confirmed at the scene, but entry and exit wounds on the torso suggested multiple gunshots. Ballistics teams flagged shell casings less than 10 feet from the remains. .40 caliber, federal brand, consistent with ammunition commonly sold at local sporting goods retailers. The angle of dispersion, along with partial footprints leading from the road, indicated the victim had not been transported by foot. She was likely carried from the vehicle and killed at the dump site. Vegetative trace samples, lichen and pine needle fragments, were collected from the victim's hair and clothing, cross-referenced against soil samples pulled earlier from the SUV's undercarriage. The forensic consistency was near identical. This confirmed that the suspect vehicle had been driven directly to the scene, remained parked for a brief window of time, and then returned westward. No tire tracks were recoverable. The area had experienced light rainfall in the early hours of October 16th. Any clear impression had already degraded by the time investigators arrived. Later that evening, Dr. Leslie Thomason of the state ME's office issued her preliminary autopsy report. Whitney Heichel had sustained at least 4 gunshot wounds. All were close range, fired from the front, aimed at the chest and abdomen. She also exhibited evidence of blunt force trauma consistent with restraint. Sexual assault was confirmed. Time of death was estimated to be within 2 hours of her initial disappearance. This shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. The window of opportunity was small. The sequence of events, from the abduction to the killing, had taken place rapidly and without deviation from a clear, predetermined path. Detectives returned to the original list of individuals who had spoken to police voluntarily on day 1. Each one was reviewed under new criteria: known vehicle ownership, access to firearms, geographic familiarity with Larch Mountain, and gaps in their timeline between 6:45 and 9 a.m. One individual stood out, not because of a criminal record, but because of a pattern. He lived in the same apartment complex as the victim. He had offered his help early. He claimed to have been at home the entire morning but couldn't confirm who had seen him. His vehicle wasn't registered in his name, and more notably, he had attended the same religious meetings as Whitney and her husband. Detectives flagged the name for further review. The recovered body and its placement told investigators what the digital evidence only hinted at. This wasn't a random act. It was staged, selected, and timed. The offender knew the landscape and the risks. He didn't panic. He didn't leave visible signs of transport, but he underestimated what the soil could retain and how quickly coordinated digital and environmental forensics could close in. Back at the station, the lead investigator updated the profile. He knew where to take her, when to move, and how to disappear, but the pattern's starting to fold. This wasn't spontaneous. It was structured. That structure, mile by mile, was now being traced in reverse. By day 3 of the investigation, the search had transitioned into a coordinated manhunt. With Whitney Heichel's body located and the cause of death confirmed, the case no longer revolved around a disappearance. This was now a homicide, with digital and environmental forensics pointing to a limited window of opportunity, a narrow timeline, and a clear demonstration of planning. The priority shifted to isolating individuals who had both proximity and access. Detectives began their first re-interviews. The approach was systematic. Focus on individuals who had previously inserted themselves into the investigation or claimed knowledge of the victim's routine. High on that list was a 24-year-old male resident of the same apartment complex. He had spoken voluntarily on day 1, mentioned knowing the Heichels through their shared Jehovah's Witness congregation, and had assisted with community search efforts. His name was already in the report: Jonathan Holt. Holt had no criminal history, no active warrants. He worked maintenance at a local Target distribution center and lived less than 100 feet from the Heichel apartment. His original statement claimed he had been home alone the morning of October 16th, watching television. He couldn't name a specific show. He couldn't recall if anyone had seen him leave or return. When asked if he had heard or seen Whitney that morning, he answered no, but then added that he thought he might have heard her SUV pulling out. The interview ended without incident. He was cooperative, offered to speak again, and provided a phone number. No red flags at that point. But what raised concern now were the inconsistencies when his statement was compared to newly verified surveillance data. Review of security camera footage from an adjacent building, one not included in the initial canvas, showed a figure leaving the parking lot in a hoodie at approximately 6:48 a.m. That timestamp was critical. It was 3 minutes after Whitney was believed to have left for work, and in the same direction her vehicle would have exited the property. While the figure's identity couldn't be confirmed from the angle, the clothing description matched what witnesses later said Holt wore when helping with searches later that day. Investigators requested Holt's cell phone records. The report came back within hours. His phone had no outgoing or incoming activity between 6:30 and 10:45 a.m., a blackout window that aligned almost exactly with the period during which Whitney was abducted, transported, and murdered. That silence was not itself proof, but it provided a contrast against average usage patterns. Holt typically sent or received at least 5 messages per hour during that time of day on the previous 5 weekdays. The sudden absence of activity, when viewed alongside his vague timeline and proximity to the victim, made his statement less reliable. Holt was called in for a second interview. This time detectives confronted him with the footage showing a person leaving the complex. He denied it was him. When asked to provide details about what he did that morning, he hesitated, repeated previous claims, and then said he might have taken a walk. That detail hadn't been mentioned before. No specifics followed. The conversation was recorded. Behavioral analysts noted signs of stress escalation, shoulder tension, jaw clenching, inconsistent eye contact, and longer pauses before responding to direct questions. These indicators were logged but not shared with him. The tone of questioning remained neutral. Back at the crime lab, fingerprint results came in. Of the partials lifted from Whitney's SUV, one latent print matched Jonathan Holt's right thumb. It was located on the inside of the passenger side window. When confronted with that result in a follow-up visit, Holt explained that he had once helped Whitney wash her car weeks prior. Investigators asked for the date. He said he couldn't remember. Detectives cross-referenced that claim with Clint Heichel. The couple had never mentioned Holt cleaning their vehicle. In fact, Whitney hadn't had her car washed in over a month, according to her husband. He added that she wasn't close with any male neighbors and wouldn't have accepted help from someone she barely knew. The contradiction deepened. Holt's casual tone didn't match the seriousness of the evidence. The fingerprint was not old. The lab determined it had no signs of degradation or environmental exposure. That meant it was left recently, possibly within hours of the crime. The investigative team updated the internal suspect priority list. Holt moved from person of interest to active subject. No charges were filed, and he was not arrested, but surveillance was placed on his apartment and his workplace. Detectives needed to avoid premature confrontation. The pattern was building, but the final connection, motive, means, and timeline had yet to lock into place. Internally, one investigator noted his story doesn't fall apart, it shifts. And people who shift their story aren't just confused, they're calculating. What began as a missing persons case had entered a new phase, forensic triangulation layered against evolving testimony, and the first cracks in the suspect's account were beginning to show under the weight of physical evidence. 3 days after Whitney Heichel's body was recovered from the wooded trail off Larch Mountain Road, the investigation entered a critical juncture. The suspect, still unnamed publicly, hadn't confessed. No direct witness had placed him at the crime scene. But each layer of forensic data now aligned with one conclusion. The suspect had moved with purpose. What investigators needed was proof that narrowed the gap between suspicion and criminal culpability. To secure that, they turned to trace evidence. The forensics unit re-examined all items collected from the Ford Explorer, now stored in the Portland Metro Evidence Lab. One microfiber cloth tucked into the side of the center console carried a faint smear of blood not previously flagged. DNA tests confirmed it was Whitney's. The cloth also had minor fiber transfers, dark cotton threads consistent with men's uniform pants worn in warehouse jobs. This detail aligned with the suspect's workplace, though it couldn't tie the material to him specifically. More compelling was what analysts recovered from the interior floor mat on the passenger side. A fine layer of soil, barely visible to the naked eye, was vacuumed, separated, and compared to samples taken from the Larch Mountain recovery site. The mineral composition, rich in quartz, feldspar, and decomposed granite, was an exact match. A forensic geologist was brought in to confirm. According to his analysis, the soil was unique to an upper elevation ridge known to be accessible by only one or two routes. That specificity allowed investigators to eliminate dozens of other trailheads, narrowing the search corridor to just 1.3 miles. Meanwhile, digital analysts isolated GPS coordinates extracted from the vehicle's internal system. A specific pause in travel occurred at 8:17 a.m., lasting 13 minutes. The SUV was stationary in the woods during that time. The pause coincided with the estimated window of death listed in the coroner's report. Combined with odometer data and signal loss from Whitney's phone, investigators were now able to anchor the moment of the crime with geographic precision. With the forensics aligning, tactical decisions followed. Surveillance on the suspect had been ongoing for 48 hours, with unmarked units tailing his movements from his apartment to his job and back. He had not attempted to flee. He continued reporting to work, remained polite with officers when approached, and even waved to detectives when he passed their cars. But his body language had changed. He had stopped speaking to neighbors. He avoided eye contact in public. His daily habits became compressed. Shorter grocery runs, limited outdoor movement. Detectives noted this as behavior consistent with someone aware of escalating scrutiny. While investigators waited for lab confirmations, they quietly approached the suspect's employer to review access logs. The facility used RFID badge swipes to track employee movement. According to those records, the suspect had not reported to work at all on October 16, the morning of Whitney's disappearance. This directly contradicted his original statement claiming he had a regular shift and stayed home only afterward due to a cold. Additionally, security camera footage from the rear lot of the warehouse showed a vehicle matching the suspect's sedan entering and exiting around 5 a.m. the day of the crime, hours before Whitney vanished. He wasn't scheduled to be on site that early. When pressed, the company confirmed he had no assigned responsibilities requiring access before 7 a.m. The time gap opened a new angle: premeditation. At this point, investigators prepared a formal interview request. The approach remained voluntary, not custodial. The interview was held in a quiet, controlled setting. A lead detective opened by reviewing prior statements. The suspect nodded, occasionally clarifying small details. Then came the shift. Detectives presented the badge logs, the warehouse footage, and the fingerprint from the SUV. The suspect's posture changed, arms crossed, eyes down, less verbal response. When asked to explain the timeline mismatch, he paused. Then he claimed he had forgotten going in early, said he might have just stopped by to check something. No explanation was given for why he accessed the building without clocking in or notifying anyone. He was not arrested after the interview. Oregon law required a stronger evidentiary threshold for probable cause, but the noose was tightening. Behind the scenes, the prosecution team was already coordinating with forensics to finalize two key exhibits: soil trace comparisons and digital GPS path overlays. These would form the basis of a potential warrant. The suspect's silence wasn't enough. What mattered was the math, the earth under the tires, and the contradiction between where he said he had been and where the evidence placed him. In the words of the lead forensic analyst, it's not about what he said, it's about what can't be undone: the soil, the path, the signal. That's what makes him visible. The next step would require consent or confrontation. 6 days had passed since Whitney Heichel was reported missing. The investigation had built methodically, from the physical recovery of her vehicle to trace soil linking it to the crime scene, and now to security logs and GPS data contradicting the suspect's alibi. But even with all that evidence, there remained a gap. The timeline was anchored. The data pointed clearly, but the threshold for an arrest warrant, probable cause with corroborated intent, had not yet been met. That changed late Friday afternoon, when lab analysts delivered an updated forensic report to the task force. In it, a new item stood out. Luminol testing inside the suspect's personal vehicle, conducted as part of a consent search 2 days earlier, had revealed cleaned blood traces on the interior of the trunk lining. Swab samples matched Whitney's DNA. The stains had been wiped, no pooling remained. But minute fragments, trapped in the texture of the lining, invisible to the eye, confirmed that Whitney had been placed inside the vehicle. The profile showed no environmental degradation, indicating the transfer occurred on the day of the crime. This evidence contradicted the suspect's own timeline, which placed him nowhere near Whitney's vehicle or body. With this confirmation, the team secured an arrest warrant for Jonathan Holt on probable cause of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and first-degree sexual assault. The warrant was executed that evening without incident. Holt was taken into custody at his apartment just after 7 p.m. He did not resist. He asked for a jacket, complied with all orders, and was transported directly to the Multnomah County Justice Center. What followed was a calculated interview under controlled conditions. Holt was read his Miranda rights, which he waived. For the next 2 hours, detectives presented him with the evidence, step by step. They began with his workplace records, then moved to his presence on security cameras, the fingerprint inside Whitney's SUV, the DNA in his trunk, and the GPS coordinates matching the murder scene. His responses were brief at first, mostly denials or vague recollections. But when confronted with the luminol results and DNA confirmation, his demeanor changed. Holt's speech became slower. He leaned forward, covered his mouth, and asked to take a break. When the interview resumed, he no longer denied involvement. The confession, when it came, wasn't emotionally charged. It was factual. He stated that he waited outside his apartment until Whitney left for work, approached her vehicle under the pretense of needing help, then forced his way in. He claimed he didn't plan to kill her, but panicked once she began crying. He drove her into the mountains, assaulted her, and shot her multiple times with a .40 caliber handgun registered to a relative. He later disposed of the weapon in a local reservoir. He also admitted to staging parts of the crime scene, breaking the window after the fact, wiping down surfaces, and attempting ATM withdrawals to redirect suspicion. These statements aligned with earlier findings and helped clarify specific gaps in the investigation, particularly the movement patterns between 7 o'clock and 9 a.m. While the motive remained murky, Holt provided no clear explanation beyond vague references to frustration and isolation. The facts of his involvement were no longer in dispute. His account matched forensic evidence, digital logs, and timeline reconstruction. That night, he was booked into county jail without bail. The community was notified the following morning. Gresham PD held a press conference confirming the arrest, offering condolences to Whitney's family, and thanking the public for their support during the multi-day search. Behind the scenes, the forensic team finalized its chain of custody reports. Every trace, blood, fiber, soil, digital ping, would be cataloged for use in the coming pretrial hearings. Prosecutors began drafting formal charges, now backed by a signed confession and a complete forensic narrative. Whitney's family was briefed privately before the public announcement. They were shown the timeline, the evidence, and the full account of what happened. There was no speculation left. There was only confirmation, delivered with precision and clarity. In the post-briefing summary report, one detective wrote, "It wasn't the confession that solved this. It was the pattern, the way he tried to hide, and the way the data refused to let him." With Jonathan Holt in custody and a signed confession on record, the investigation entered its prosecutorial phase. The groundwork for trial wasn't built on courtroom performance or dramatic testimony. It rested on methodical preparation, comprehensive evidence review, and strict adherence to procedure. No detail could be left unverified. Every data point had to be anchored, reproducible, and legally admissible. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office established a dedicated team to oversee the case. Assistant DA Sarah Nash led the file review. Her background included a decade in homicide prosecution and extensive experience in digital evidence presentation. She coordinated directly with forensic analysts, law enforcement, and victim advocacy teams to prepare for pre-trial proceedings. The evidence chain was sorted by type and function: physical trace, blood, soil, fiber; digital, GPS data, phone records, badge logs; testimonial, interview transcripts, confession; and behavioral, surveillance logs, neighbor observations, suspect routine. No category operated in isolation. Each piece built toward a larger framework, demonstrating opportunity, means, movement, concealment, and post-crime conduct. One item under particular scrutiny was the .40 caliber weapon described in Holt's confession. He claimed to have discarded it in a nearby reservoir. Dive teams were dispatched, and within 72 hours, the firearm was recovered roughly 15 feet offshore, wrapped in a cloth and partially embedded in sediment. Serial numbers were still legible. The gun was registered to Holt's father. Ballistic testing confirmed that the shell casings found at the mountain scene matched the recovered weapon. Gunshot residue was also lifted from the vehicle's interior door panel, where Holt had likely rested the firearm en route to the forest. Additionally, the forensic entomology report was finalized. Based on insect activity found on Whitney's remains, time of death estimates were refined to between 8:10 and 8:30 a.m., perfectly aligning with the GPS data showing the SUV idle near the remote ridge. This correlation between biological and digital timelines became one of the strongest pillars in the case. Jurors wouldn't have to speculate. The time, location, and method of the crime were mapped to within a 20-minute window, using independent sources that corroborated one another. Digital analysts retrieved deleted searches from Holt's phone history. Days before the murder, he had visited websites related to off-road access points near Gresham and searched the phrase, "How deep is Blue Lake, Oregon?" This discovery, while circumstantial, gave insight into planning. Combined with the early morning entry into his workplace for no legitimate reason, prosecutors now had motive evolution, preparatory behaviors, location scouting, and concealment efforts. In parallel, witness coordination began. More than a dozen community members, church acquaintances, and co-workers were interviewed again. Their statements, while not damning on their own, painted a pattern of increasing detachment and unusual behavior in Holt's demeanor during the weeks prior. A few noted he had become withdrawn. Others described vague complaints about being ignored or not seen. While these didn't speak directly to motive, they offered a profile that supported prosecutorial narrative: isolation, fixation, and escalation. A separate pretrial filing focused on psychological evaluation. Holt had no diagnosed mental illness but agreed to undergo an assessment by a state-appointed forensic psychologist. The evaluation found no signs of psychosis or cognitive impairment. He was deemed fit to stand trial. When asked why he committed the crime, his responses were vague. He spoke of feeling desperate and claimed it wasn't about her. Prosecutors would not present mental illness as a mitigating factor. The case file, now numbering over 400 pages, was nearly complete. On November 1st, formal charges were filed: 1 count of aggravated murder with a firearm, 1 count of first-degree kidnapping, and 1 count of first-degree rape. The court scheduled an arraignment for the following week. Bail was denied. Media attention returned, but this time the narrative had shifted. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was an evidentiary structure: cold, detailed, irrefutable. The public wanted accountability. The family wanted peace. Prosecutors wanted clarity before trial. The lead detective summarized the tone in her internal memo. The investigation was built on silence, his, and the kind that followed her disappearance. Now every piece speaks for her. The courtroom in downtown Portland wasn't designed for spectacle. Pale walls, neutral wood benches, and an American flag that didn't move. No cameras, no crowd theatrics, just order, oath, and evidence. Trial proceedings began with the same clinical tone that had defined the investigation. The State of Oregon v. Jonathan Holt was opened by the prosecution with a clear mission: establish premeditation, demonstrate sequence, and frame intent through corroborated forensic proof. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Nash made no reference to emotion. She outlined a timeline built entirely on measurable data: cell pings, GPS logs, physical trace evidence, and Holt's own conflicting accounts. Her opening statement lasted 11 minutes. The defense strategy was less assertive. Holt's legal counsel did not dispute that his vehicle had Whitney Heichel's blood in the trunk. They didn't deny the presence of his fingerprint inside her SUV. Nor did they contest that he was seen on surveillance leaving his apartment at the same time her vehicle departed. What they did argue was motive, or rather, the absence of one. Holt, they claimed, had snapped without warning, without pre-planning, and without the intent to kill. Their narrative leaned toward diminished capacity and emotional instability, though no mental illness was diagnosed. Jurors were presented with the soil samples first. The forensic geologist explained, under oath, the uniqueness of the decomposed granite and high silica concentrations from Larch Mountain. Side-by-side comparisons showed the soil found on the SUV's floor mat and the burial site were an identical match. Then came the digital reconstruction. Analysts walked the court through GPS data that pinpointed the SUV's travel path, including the idle pause near the ridge. Video overlays synchronized those stops with ATM withdrawal attempts and data blackouts from Holt's phone. Everything lined up. The recovered firearm was entered into evidence. Ballistic testing confirmed it as the weapon used. The prosecution presented the cloth it had been wrapped in and displayed the serial number tracing it back to Holt's father's home, an address investigators had already searched with a signed warrant. On day 4, the confession was introduced. It was not read aloud in full. Instead, select excerpts were entered as summary exhibits. Jurors saw transcribed responses in which Holt admitted to staging the vehicle, wiping prints, and returning home after disposing of Whitney's body. The language was flat, no dramatics, just admissions. The most damning detail came when he described pausing to reload the gun before the final shots. That statement alone eliminated any argument that the act was impulsive. No family members were called to testify. The state determined that emotional impact statements would be reserved for sentencing, should a conviction be reached. Witnesses from the Heichel's church congregation were brought in briefly to confirm that Holt and Whitney knew each other in passing. None had seen them interact beyond surface greetings. On day 7, closing arguments were made. Nash recapped the digital timeline against Holt's verbal lies. She noted that the soil didn't lie, the fingerprint didn't lie, the recovered weapon didn't lie. She concluded with a sentence stripped of theatricality. The evidence tells the story. It begins with pretext and ends with intent. Deliberation began at 3:12 p.m. Jurors requested one clarification, replaying the segment on GPS timing and the SUV's pause near the ridge. The replay took 5 minutes. The verdict was returned the next morning, guilty on all counts, aggravated murder, first-degree kidnapping, and first-degree rape. Sentencing followed 2 weeks later. Holt was given life without the possibility of parole. Oregon law allowed for such a sentence in aggravated cases involving sexual assault and evidence of premeditation. There was no appeal filed in the first 30-day window. In the weeks after the trial, local news reported quiet tributes across Gresham. A park bench near the coffee shop where Whitney had worked was engraved with her name. Her husband, Clint, chose not to speak publicly. Detectives involved in the case declined interviews. The file was closed and archived. Internally, the lead forensic investigator wrote a final memo to Case Command. Closure never comes easy, but justice, when measured step by step, holds. In the end, it wasn't just a story about a crime. It was a lesson in how silence, patterns, and routine can mask unthinkable intentions. As someone who followed this case from the very first missing person report to the final court verdict, I walk away with this. Trust your instincts, speak up early, and never underestimate the value of small details. Justice isn't always loud, but it is relentless when guided by truth. What do you think stood out the most in this case? Was it the digital trail, the human behavior, or the silence that spoke volumes? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. If this story moved you, or made you pause for even a second, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case. And if it didn't, tell me why. This channel is a place for real conversation, and your voice matters.